Darkness has always been an ally to fear. It is the hour when the sea seems endless, when the sky above becomes an unbroken depth of black, and the only constant sound is the trembling hum of engines over salt-laden wind. In the Pacific of 1943, that darkness belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their reconnaissance planes glided unseen across vast stretches of ocean, and their night raiders struck with impunity. To American sailors and airmen, the night sky had become a blind kingdom ruled by ghosts. No radar yet sharp enough, no pilot yet trained enough, no defense yet proven strong enough to wrest sovereignty back from the shadows. The young men of Japan's Naval Air Force carried an almost theatrical confidence in those years. Many had grown up believing that mastery of night flying required intuition rather than machinery, spirit rather than instruments. They had slipped across the Aleutians into the Solomons, over Rabaul, and back through fog and storm, vanishing into the same black shroud that confounded their enemy. To them, the Americans were clumsy in the dark, tethered to primitive radar screens, reliant on commands from the ground, their reactions slowed by instruments they barely trusted. They chase shadows, one Japanese flyer later recalled, paraphrased from a wartime diary found at Truk, while we chase the light of their fear. The mockery carried the ring of truth in early 1943. US night fighters, few and experimental, were still an afterthought. Modified bombers and single-seat interceptors groping through murk with unreliable radar sets bolted awkwardly to their noses. The men who flew them fought a triple battle, against the weather, against invisible enemies, and against the limits of technology. The Navy had learned bitter lessons from the first air raids on Guadalcanal and the vulnerable convoys at sea. They could win by day, when the Hellcats and coursers struck under cloudless blue. But once the sun vanished, the balance of the Pacific tilted again toward Japan. Far beneath that contest of machines and men lay a more haunting unease, the sense that science had not yet pierced the oldest frontier of warfare, the night itself. American planners pored over reports from Britain, where radar had already rewritten the aerial war against Germany's bombers. Could the same principles arm a single pilot at sea? Could a fighter become its own searchlight, seeing through darkness without the gift of sight? Engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory wrestled with equations that vibrated between hope and lunacy. The radar modules they designed were heavy, fragile and capricious, glowing with their own miniature flickers of lightning. Yet these crude boxes represented vision of the future, the promise that electronic eyes might someday equal human instinct. Out across the Pacific, Japanese crews laughed at the idea. Mechanization, they believed, dulled courage. Instruments clouded intuition. The imperial myth held that a pilot's spirit of Kodo, the way of the emperor, could master any condition. They trained to read stars through canopy glare, to memorize wind currents by ear, to land on carriers using nothing but reflection from waves. American radar was, to them, a crutch for a blind giant. A pilot who relied on such tools, they said, could never feel the sky. Yet even pride has its half-life. By mid-1943, the tides of war were rearranging. American industry had begun to overflow with innovation and production. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, wide-winged, muscular, patient, emerged from Long Island factories faster than pilots could learn her name. She was a machine built not for elegance but for survival. Clad in thick armor, armed with 650 caliber guns, the Hellcat turned combat into sustained endurance. By day, she already broke Japan's best. By night, she waited for a transformation still rumored in test hangars and secret training bases from Rhode Island to Oahu. That change came not from generals but from engineers and a handful of restless aviators who refused to accept blindness as destiny. In dark rooms lit by oscilloscopes, scientists fused new radar miniaturization with the Hellcat's sturdy frame, creating something half mythic, half mechanical, a predator endowed with electronic sight. The first prototypes, dubbed Project AAI, felt almost alive to those who flew them. The screens glowed green within each cockpit, tracing unseen echoes of the sea and air. For the first time, a pilot could hunt without light, finding an enemy's pulse amid static. Still, technology alone promised nothing. The first radar-equipped Hellcats were temperamental, their airborne intercept radar finicky as an infant heart. Pilots trained under secrecy and brine filled nights off Quonset and Ford Island, learning to translate flickers into motion, sound into geometry. Some faltered, some refused, others became enchanted. Lieutenant Cecil H. Zeke Holloway, one of the early instructors, later described the ordeal as like teaching your eyes to hear. For months, success was statistical despair. Intercepts missed, contacts lost, radar units failing mid-flight. But behind every failure lay progress measured in inches and heartbeats. Meanwhile, the Japanese underestimated how quickly the Americans could adapt. They still patrolled the waters around Truk and the Marianas, convinced that darkness would forever be their ally. Cruisers steamed at ease during moonless hours. Bombers set out on small harassing raids against American anchorages, confident that only searchlights and luck opposed them. On nights when tracer-rounds laced across the surf, their pilots thought of it as sport. One diary from a Japanese naval aviator, dated September 1943, reads, "We run the ocean at night as fishermen do. They are still children of the day." But across that same horizon, new fighter squadrons were forming aboard US carriers, the Navy's night air groups. Their arrival signalled an invisible shift. On carriers like the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown, engineers carved out windowless rooms where young operators trained on cathode screens. Men barely 20 learned to speak a language of echoes, guiding their wingmen onto targets neither could see. It was a silent partnership between man and machine, a duet in darkness. The term night fighter acquired meaning not just tactical but philosophical, a belief that the human eye, when amplified by patience and invention, could reclaim even the blackest hour. The Pacific, meanwhile, gave no forgiveness. Moonlight could reveal clouds like walls. Islands loomed as phantom shapes. Sudden storms extinguished bearings. Every hour at night risked mechanical failure, vertigo, or collision. Yet through that shifting chaos, the radar-fanged Hellcat began to prowl, an apparition whose pilots called themselves Batmen of the Navy. They flew blind, save for a trembling green circle on the instrument panel that pulsed like a living heart. Through static and darkness they learned an art, to stalk a moving blip till its centre bloomed bright, then close the distance until silhouette became certainty, until the machine gun's tracers unravelled the night. In the first months their victories were few and often disbelieved. Commanders doubted reports of kills without witnesses. Japanese survivors, astonished by unseen attackers, assumed accidents or engine failures. But slowly, across late 1944 and 1945, the Pacific night changed temperament. The predators of one season became the prey of the next. It is here that history takes its quiet pivot, the moment when arrogance met innovation and where faith in human instinct collided with the silent language of electronics. The radar-equipped Hellcat did not roar into legend instantly. It crept there, pulse by pulse, discovery by discovery. Yet beneath its humming circuits resided the oldest human urge, to banish fear with understanding. From the decks of warships gliding through black swell to the hidden airfields carved from coral, new pilots prepared to inherit the night. Engineers adjusted tuning knobs, mechanics wiped salt from emitters, commanders plotted unseen patrol lines across chartless ocean. Uncounted miles away, Japanese pilots boasted in lantern-lit briefings that the dark will always belong to Nippon's wings. But as 1944 unfolded and the Pacific air turned thick with retribution, a different breed of hunter was already rising to meet them, one that did not rely on moonlight, one that could see through its absence. The night itself was about to change sides. The first radar-equipped Hellcats joined the fleet quietly, without ceremony or the usual fanfare of new aircraft. Aboard aging carriers like the Enterprise and the Intrepid, engineering crews worked through sleepless nights, bolting the black fin-tipped antennas of the ANA PS-6 radar to the rounded noses of their planes. It was late 1943, the war still uncertain, the Pacific vast and tireless. The pilots chosen for this experiment were volunteers, or sometimes simply the ones who refused to sleep. They called their new assignments blind dates with ghosts. Each takeoff meant stepping into a void where even moonlight abandoned them. Still, faith had begun to tilt. Faith not in the old instincts of celestial navigation, but in the pale rhythms of the glowing scope before their knees. At first, the results were comical in their frustration. pilots chased cloud reflections or waves that winked back from their screens like false enemy signatures. One trainee, Ensign William Budd Garrison, joked in a letter home that the contraption was good for finding thunderstorms and losing your sanity. His humour masked terror. The learning curve was brutal. To watch a tiny blip slide across darkness and interpret it as a living enemy was like deciphering Morse code from angels. But the Hellcat, rugged and patient, tolerated their errors. It kept them aloft long enough to translate those blips into kills. The first confirmed radar-guided victory came on a humid night near the Solomons. 2 G4M Betty bombers sought the American convoy below, their engines droning like insects among clouds. Guided by shipborne radar, a single Hellcat climbed to intercept. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Coleman Moose. Miller's voice trembled as he read the shifting shapes on his scope. 15 miles. 10. At 4 miles, the signal brightened. He opened throttle, trusting mathematics rather than eyesight. Moments later, he glimpsed a silhouette sliding across starlight. His guns spoke, short bursts, then silence. The Betty plunged in flames through its own moonlight. Back aboard the carrier, no one celebrated loudly. It was success born of equations, precise and unromantic. But war hardly cared for romance. What mattered was that, for the first time, the night could bleed on both sides. By early 1944, the Navy understood what it possessed. Night air groups expanded, pairing pilot and radar operator in perfected synchrony. One guided by voice from the ship's combat information center, the other by the electronic hum within his cockpit. Each mission wrote a new gospel of patience. Pilots learned to trust unseen partners. Men hunched over green scopes below deck, whispering ranges like prayers. Their language carried an intimacy unknown to daylight dogfighters. Turn left 5, steady. Target bearing 072, range 6 miles. Godspeed. Across the Pacific, Japanese planners barely noticed at first. Their air patrols continued routine operations from Truk and Rabaul, convinced that any radar-assisted success must be fluke or propaganda. Japanese intelligence officers dismissed American radar as too fragile for the tropics. But then came the Marianas, summer 1944, an upheaval of strategy, a confrontation that would prove the night was no longer theirs. The islands of Saipan and Tinian trembled under bombardment by day. By night, the US carriers formed rings of steel and light, ringed by destroyers whose guns pointed to a sky no human eye could read. Here, the radar-fanged Hellcats began their hunt in earnest. Squadrons from VFN 76 and VFN 101 rose into blackness like hornets from smoke, guided by invisible hands below. Japanese Betty bombers approaching these floating cities expected darkness to conceal them, but found their own shadows betrayed by radar echoes. Dozens perished before realizing anyone knew they were there. In Tokyo, shocked officers reviewed loss reports that sounded impossible. Planes ambushed where no light existed. Crews killed before even sighting their foe. The mockery once spoken in mess halls fell away. Radar eyes, one surviving pilot called them, the Americans have eyes in the dark. By autumn, the transformation bordered on myth. Hellcats no longer waited for storm cover or moonlight. They sought it. Their pilots dove through cloud banks where fire and lightning merged into strange beauty. Without ground control, they still captured signals, 1 heartbeat per revolution of the antenna, until those pulses aligned with their own breathing. It was a new species of warfare, silence, followed by sudden revelation. The Japanese night fighters, once elegant and certain, learned their own engines betrayed them. Every propeller note echoed in an instrument somewhere on an American plane. Every spark became a signature on a radar screen. To vanish now required more than courage. It required a darkness deeper than technology could pierce, and such darkness no longer existed. More than machinery, though, changed within the men themselves. For some, the night became sacred ground, a private temple of calm amid chaos. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hara, who led one of the late 1944 night groups, called it a silence that teaches humility. In his journal he wrote, paraphrased, "When you cannot see your enemy, you are left to see yourself. The radar shows you where he is, your conscience shows you what you are." Each victory carried a quiet intimacy that daylight never knew. one fleeting intrusion of light, then the abyss closing again. The joy of survival was muted by the strangeness of having killed someone unseen. Even among friends, these pilots spoke softly of their trades, describing not battles but sensations, a faint glow, a heartbeat in static, a flash that erased an echo. Yet battles continued to demand their due. Technological triumph could not soften mechanical truth. Night landings on carrier decks, guided by dim amber lights and the measured hand signals of deck crews, remained hazards equal to combat itself. Many pilots who mastered radar died returning home. One misread wind, one broken wire, one invisible wave slamming a 10-ton aircraft into unseen ocean. To those left alive, the sea became both altar and grave. Operators listening through headphones would hear the sudden flatline of static and whisper into silence. He's gone. No trumpet, no witness, just a line on a logbook erased by dawn. Still, these losses forged a fraternity unspoken. Across vast waters, the night fighter squadrons formed a world within a world. Their camaraderie thrived on brevity, letters scrawled between sorties, half jokes about living as bats. Each man came to accept darkness not as void, but as companion. When daylight pilots mocked them as the ghost herders, they merely nodded, for ghosts were all they ever met, and some part of them had already joined that spectral company. By winter, 1944-45, the radar Hellcats reached their apotheosis. At the Battle of Okinawa, they roamed the detritus of war, burning oil slicks, drifting wrecks, stray suicide missions. Night after night they rose, intercepting air raids long before eyes could detect them. The Japanese had begun to rely on kamikaze strikes even under moonless skies, assuming descent into total darkness would grant surprise. Instead, the glowing scopes of the Hellcats foretold each attack minutes ahead. Interceptors climbed, unseen, and carved through the desperate formation. Witnesses aboard American carriers told of black nights flashing suddenly with arc lines of tracer fire, streaks of green and red vanishing into the void. When silence returned, all that lingered was the smell of cordite and the rhythmic pulse of engine cooling against sea wind. On land, the Japanese airfield stood barren of confidence. By 1945, most veteran aces were gone, replaced by teenagers trembling over instruments they scarcely understood. They inherited pride, but not mastery. Their instructors no longer promised invincibility in darkness. They whispered instead of vengeance and faith. Some still joked bitterly about American lightning machines, but the laughter never reached their eyes. The radar-fanged Hellcat had become more than an opponent. It was the embodiment of inevitability, of a war slipping from human hands into those of machines that never slept. And with that inevitability came tragedy, on both sides. In July 1945, one night patrol intercepted a flight of twin-engine bombers northwest of Japan. Among them was an old hand, Lieutenant Sakamoto Hiroshi, famed for his early raids on Guadalcanal. His plane was caught in the beams of an unseen pursuer. He tried evasive dives, sharp turns he once taught as doctrine, but each maneuver was mirrored, anticipated. He broke through a ragged cloud to see tracers converging from nowhere, a hunter glimpsed only at the instant of death. The wreckage sank into the Pacific, its fire reflected on wave crests before fading entirely. Back at base, his comrades waited, glancing toward the empty corridor between hangars where he used to tell stories about American fear of the dark. Now that corridor held only echoes. Through countless such skirmishes, one truth hardened like iron. The age of instinct alone had passed. Technology was no longer the servant of courage, it was part of courage itself. The men who mocked machines now perished by them, and the men who trusted machines were consumed by awe at what they had unleashed. For every radar victory still demanded a human to interpret those ghostly signals, to choose when and whom to destroy. No instrument could absolve that responsibility. As Japan crumbled in the summer of 1945, the night fighters had fulfilled their grim evolution. From fragile prototypes born in fear, they had become sovereigns of the dark. The same sky that once concealed Japanese might now reveal their ruin. When atomic fire later blossomed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it seemed almost a symbolic extension of that conquest of darkness. A light no one wished for, banishing night not with insight but with oblivion. In surviving footage filmed from American decks after victory, Hellcats glide overhead at dusk, their radar domes gleaming faintly against cloud-washed sky. The voices of their pilots, older now tempered by duty, speak in half-muted pride. They had taken back the night, but somewhere in the tone lingers uncertainty. Had they simply replaced one superstition with another, the belief that technology could redeem terror? Under the calm Pacific horizon, coral and wreckage rest entwined, the bones of both hunter and hunted sleeping in mutual silence. Above them, satellites now trace orbits brighter than any radar scope once flickered, still scanning, still watching. And across 7 decades of distance, the story of those men, Japanese and American alike, endures as a quiet argument between courage and invention, between darkness and the human need to see. In the pallid glow of their memories, one question continues to rise like mist from the ocean. When men finally learned to own the dark, did they make it safer, or merely make it their own mirror? For beyond every victory lies a shadow waiting to be claimed again. And in that shadow, history prepares its next lesson. In the quiet that followed the war's last night flight, the world looked toward dawn, uncertain whether the age of light would bring comfort or reveal the cost of seeing everything at last. When the war finally stopped breathing, the silence felt impossible. In that hush, the sea seemed vaster than ever, an endless mirror where the wreckage of dreams and machines drifted together without distinction. The Hellcats that had once ruled the darkness were chained again to flight decks, their radar eyes dimmed, their claws blunted. Some went to museums, some to scrapyards. A few lingered in hangars, stripped of wings, as if ashamed of what they had become, symbols of victory welded to instruments of regret. History would call them triumphs of technology, milestones in the evolution of air combat. Yet behind those aluminum skins remained the echoes of young voices, half in awe, half in fear, whispering through static at 40,000 feet. Through official reports, the ledger of loss looked deceptively clear. Japan's Night Air Force annihilated, its pilots scattered or dead, the US Navy's intercept record polished into doctrine. But statistics never quite speak truthfully about the cost of sight. For every plane brought down, a human presence vanished into darkness. One more spark extinguished over an ocean that could never hold its dead. The radar that measured others' positions could not calculate the weight of a life, ended by a green blur on a scope. After surrender, the surviving Japanese aviators returned to an altered sky. The empire whose banners they had carried no longer existed. Many came home to empty airfields. Disbanded units, broken runways overtaken by weeds. Some became farmers again, tending the same soil that once financed their war. Others could not find the language to speak of what they had seen. One veteran wrote years later in his memoir, paraphrased, "The night betrayed us not because it turned against us, but because we thought we owned it." His words touched something universal, the illusion that nature itself can belong to any human hand. Across the ocean, American veterans carried their own ghosts. For them, radar remained both companion and confessor. Its circular screens had shown them brief silhouettes, electric fossils of the lives they erased. A few of those night fighter pilots later became pioneers in a new world of flight, testing jets, guiding commercial liners through storm cloud midnights. Their instruments became safer, cleaner, quieter, yet even in peacetime, when radar became a servant of civilian safety, they could not forget its first purpose, to make killing precise. Some wrote quietly to former enemies, exchanging letters that tried to bridge the silence. A rare few met in person decades later, standing together before the rusted carcass of a Hellcat in a Pacific museum. They bowed, not to symbols of victory or defeat, but to those who never came home from either sky. In that shared stillness, one truth lingered. Progress and mercy rarely walk the same path. The very science that restored vision to blindness also taught new ways to wage war. The Hellcats' legacy lived on in radar-guided missiles, in night vision targeting systems, in satellites that could pierce clouds across the planet. Each generation of invention promised safety, yet each carried the same question that haunted those first night hunters. Where does sight end and conscience begin? The Pacific itself never answered. Beneath its calm surface lie the bones of both conqueror and conquered, equal at last beneath weightless water. Coral gardens bloom around shattered engines, fish drift through broken canopies. The ocean erases nationality more faithfully than memory ever could. Above, tourists travel in planes guided by radar so refined it can see storms forming hundreds of miles away. They look down from their windows at the velvet dark, unaware that beneath them, the very technology keeping them safe was once a weapon that owned the night. For historians, the transformation of those radar-fanged Hellcats stands as a turning point in the age of human perception. It marked the moment when war rewrote its rules, when courage alone was no longer enough, and understanding the invisible became as vital as wielding the visible. But for humanity at large, it offers a quieter reflection. Fear is rarely conquered. It is only translated, from darkness into data, from instinct into signal. The men of both nations learned that mastery of technology does not mean mastery of the soul that commands it. Listen closely to the testimonies recorded decades later, and their tone softens into something almost gentle. One American pilot, grey-haired and tear-lined, told an interviewer, paraphrased, "I used to think we beat them because we could see in the dark. Now I think we were both just scared of what we couldn't see." It is a confession so simple it sounds like prayer. Behind every glow of progress, there is always that same darkness, patient, expectant, waiting to remind us of our limits. How easily nations mocked one another, believing courage could eclipse circumstance. How swiftly pride turned to silence under the hum of a tiny circular screen. The Japanese pilots who laughed at the Americans' instruments did not live to see that laughter reflected back in blue phosphor light. But neither side truly won the night. They only transformed it, repainting it with human longing and mechanical precision. What they inherited was not ownership but understanding, an awareness that light and shadow can trade masters when arrogance ignores the horizon. In the decades since, the Pacific sky has healed into quiet indifference. Cargo planes hum across the same routes where burning wrecks once fell. Ships sail guided by the descendants of those same radar pulses. Nations that once bled across those waters now share technology, trade and mourning. Yet the memory remains, suspended between gratitude and grief. The night no longer hides its watchers, but the cost of that clarity is something humanity keeps paying, layer by layer, with every new device that turns darkness into data. If one listens on windless nights near the old bases of Saipan or Okinawa, there is still a faint echo in the air, the resonance of propellers mixing with memory, a rhythm between thunder and heartbeat. It speaks not of enemies or victors, but of fragile men who tried to understand a sky too large for certainty. So many of them chase shadows that were in truth reflections of themselves. In that sense, the legacy of the radar-fanged Hellcat is not warfare's technical triumph, but its moral question. How does one navigate progress without losing humanity along the way? The pilots of both flags gave one answer through sacrifice. Their machines mastered the night, but not the darkness within. The rest of us continue the search, peering through our own instruments for some line of balance between knowledge and compassion. Perhaps that is the most enduring inheritance of their story. We look upon the blue glow of our screens, the radar of our own age. We live surrounded by light, yet still fear what may lie beyond its reach. The lesson from the Pacific night waits quietly behind every luminous display, that every technology that promises to see for us also tempts us to stop feeling. And when empathy fades to static, we are blind once more. So the Hellcats sleep now, under glass and dust, their teeth of radar long rusted. Visitors pass by, tracing fingertips along flaking insignia, reading placards that explain how these machines won the dark. Few notice the faint reflection staring back from that polished metal, an image not of victory, but of humanity gazing into its own shadow. For though time has swallowed the roar of engines and the cries of men, the darkness they both fought over remains infinite, waiting, and somewhere, within that quiet abyss, one question burns as steady as starlight. We learned how to see through night itself, but did we ever learn what it means to see each other?